Hey, welcome. Today's episode, I want to explore the question, is all healthcare created equal, and what have the medical malpractice laws done to address that? Hey, everybody, Frank Spector. Welcome to Straight Talk, where I pull back the curtain on medical malpractice, give you some information that you may not have heard from other attorneys. This gives me an opportunity in a more long form to be able to talk about some of these issues in depth. I do a lot of shorts on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, but I don't really have the time to explore issues more in depth. If you're watching on YouTube, hey, thanks for watching this. If you're listening to Spotify and you're listening to the audio version, thanks for tuning in. Please leave your comments below because I want to hear how you feel about the podcast, and I want to be able to provide information that you want to know in an enjoyable and maybe entertaining way, even though it's a serious subject. So those of us who live in a city center, now I practice in Maryland, so I'm more familiar with the areas around Baltimore, but it applies no matter where you live. If you live close to a city center in a metropolitan area, you probably have a lot of hospitals with more sophisticated training. You're going to have hospitals that deal with trauma, surgery. They're going to be able to deal with more complicated medical procedures, maybe more complicated diagnosis or cancer treatment. They may have more sophisticated labor and delivery units. And God forbid, if your child needs to be in the intensive care unit, they're going to have more sophisticated equipment there. But as you leave the city center, especially if you go into more rural areas, the level of care is not going to be as sophisticated. That doesn't mean that doctors are dumb. It doesn't mean that they're not caring people. It's just the nature of living near a city center. It attracts the doctors who want to practice in those areas. They want to live in a city. And the rural areas are really for more of the internal medicine care, the day-to-day care. It doesn't really provide a lot of the more sophisticated medical care that people need. Now, unfortunately, many people don't know that. They think that all healthcare is the same. They think that all doctors are the same. But we know that everybody's different. Doctors are human beings, just like lawyers, just like any other profession. They're human beings. And not everybody is trained to the level as the other person. And sometimes the level of care is not the same when you leave the city center and you go to more rural areas. And those of you who live in more rural areas, I want you to understand this because you do need your local hospitals. I'm a big proponent of local hospitals. But there's a limit to what the local hospitals can do. They just don't have the equipment, and sometimes they just don't have the most sophisticated doctors to be able to deal with more complicated issues. So if you're living in a rural area and you do have something serious and you're able to get to a city center, that's what I think is the best recommendation that I can give you. Now, I've been doing medical malpractice for 35 years. I've seen very, very rural hospital settings. I once had a case in Georgia where I was at a very small hospital and they got in over their head because they were involved in something that should not have happened just because they were a very small rural hospital. It doesn't mean their heart wasn't in the right place. It just means they didn't have the training or the resources to deal with what that case was about. So I have a lot of familiarity with what I'm talking about. So how have the medical malpractice laws addressed that? Well, in Maryland, we used to have something called the locality rule, which means that we judge a doctor by the standards of care in that particular community. So we wouldn't hold a doctor in Baltimore to the same standard that we would hold a doctor in a more rural place in Maryland. Now, on the one hand, people may think, well, that sounds pretty fair. We shouldn't hold a doctor in a rural area to the same standard as a doctor, let's say, in Baltimore. But that really didn't prove to be fair. And you know that in this podcast, I talk about the truth. We do have a broken system, and I've had episodes, please look at episode number 1 that talks about a broken system. But here, it just wasn't fair because we have to have some national standard. It's not fair to a person who lives in a rural area to go to a hospital and not be able to pursue a medical malpractice case based on some local standards. There has to be some national standard. And that's what the law now says. There's one national standard that applies to all doctors. So every emergency room doctor is held to the same standard of care, no matter where they are. And that goes for every doctor, every surgeon, every healthcare provider, no matter where they're located, they're held to the same standard of care as somebody in a city center. Now, to me, I think that's the only fair approach, because otherwise you would have different standards of care no matter where you live. There would be countless different standards of care. It would also hurt the medical profession, because how in the world are doctors supposed to learn what the accepted practices are? They're only supposed to learn what's in their community. Well, suppose they leave that community. Suppose they go to a city center and they don't have the training and they don't know what the standards are in that city center. Well, that's going to be dangerous for patients and unfair to the doctor who hasn't had the proper training. So I just wanted you to know that not all healthcare is created equal. And if you do live in a rural area and you do have something serious, let's say it's not something that needs immediate attention, here's what I recommend. God forbid, I hope this doesn't happen to you, but if you did have a very rare cancer, or not even such a rare cancer, and you needed the best care, my suggestion would be to get yourself to Baltimore, to go to Johns Hopkins, to go to University of Maryland, because they can provide you with the most cutting edge treatment. Those treatments may not be available to you in your rural hospital, and you may not have a cancer doctor who has the level of training needed to give you the best chance of cure and survival. So if you are fortunate enough to live near a city center, like Baltimore, like Washington, like Philadelphia, take advantage of what your state and your city has to offer. Don't just go to a rural hospital and think that you're going to be able to be taken care of to the same level. I know this sounds harsh, and I know those of you out there, especially doctors who are in rural hospitals, will probably leave me comments saying that I'm wrong. And I respect difference of opinion, and that's what this podcast is supposed to generate. I want to hear from you. I want to hear the other side of the story too. But I can tell you from my experience, working on hundreds and hundreds of cases, I see it for myself. So I really appreciate all this information that you're going to give me, and I'm going to come back onto the podcast and address all those comments for you. But today, I just wanted to bring out the message to you that not all healthcare is created equal. I really appreciate you listening to this or watching this on YouTube. Stay tuned for another episode of Straight Talk, pulling back the curtains of medical malpractice real soon.